two objectives. In today's presentation, I have two objectives. Firstly, I wish to demonstrate my humor model, which is an adapted version of the general theory of verbal humor that I adapted to make it more suitable for the analysis of humor in poetry. And secondly, I wish to apply that model to the poetry of Heinrich Heine, especially his early lyrical poetry. Specifically, I want to look at the phenomenon of mythological resignification. This is the adaptation of mythical imagery to a new cultural context. Drescher has demonstrated that this practice is present in Heine's later ironic and satirical poetry. But there's also a lot of mythical and folkloristic imagery in Heine's earlier poetry, and I wish to use my model to assess what humor adds to Heine's use of mythological imagery in this earlier poetry, especially in Buch der Lieder, the Book of Songs. So my theory starts from the concept of script. Based on earlier script theory, I claim that every script corresponds to a situation, and I define a situation as having a central fear of desire. It includes the perceptions typical of the situation, which a reader can recognize in a text and use to recognize the situation. Central fear or desire, which is the central motivation, and experiences had when pursuing the central fear or desire. So if you have the script of going to a restaurant, which is quite a famous example of a script, but in order to order food, you have to use a strange kind of currency. The use of that strange kind of currency would also be part of the script in my model. So there are different affects present in a script. There is the base affect, which defines the central motivation, so the central fear or desire of the script. For example, and I will continue to use the example of the restaurant script. The base affect of the restaurant script would be the desire to enjoy a nice meal. This is a positive base affect. And then there are meta affects. Meta affect is a concept introduced by Doležel and Godin. These are other affects that modify how we feel about the central affect. So there are meta affects that have the same valence as the base affect. So in the case of the restaurant script, this could be the desire to feel fancy at a fancy restaurant. This is also a positive affect. And there are opposite valence affects, for example, the fear of having to pay an expensive bill. This is negative. This has an opposite valence to the base affect. So based on these affects, humorous tension can be created. Humorous tension is defined as a tension between two cognitive affective instincts. The first instinct is that of justification maintenance. This is the impulse to maintain a script when it is socially or culturally desirable. For example, keeping up appearances at a fancy restaurant. You want to act like you're having dinner at a fancy restaurant because it's socially desirable to behave in the correct way and to have the correct experiences. The second instinct is that of meta-affective switch. This occurs when an opposite valence meta-affect overpowers the base affect, and it creates an impulse to switch away from the script and focus on the meta-affect. So if you go to a fancy restaurant, but you want to avoid having to pay a huge bill, if the fear of having to pay the huge bill overpowers the desire to have a nice meal, you want to switch away from the situation of being in a restaurant. So text can build humorous tension in two ways. Firstly, by gradually forcing the reader to shift their focus towards an opposite valence meta affect. And so this has to happen gradually, and then you get a delayed meta-affective switch. So you already know there's a opposite valence meta-affect, but you don't immediately want to switch away from the original script. But the instinct of meta-affective switch builds up throughout the text, and so you get a delayed meta-affective switch. And secondly, a text can offer hyper-creative ways to forcefully maintain the script. And so despite of the delayed meta-affective switch becoming more powerful, the text offers ways to keep interpreting everything as being all right, as belonging to the original script. It offers pseudo resolutions for the incongruity created by the opposite valence meta affect. So yes, so there are 4 ways in which a text can introduce a delayed meta-affective switch, and there are 4 ways in which a text can introduce a pseudo resolution. And what I will argue is that there's a type of poetic image corresponding to every way. So there are 8 strategies in total, and every strategy corresponds to a type of poetic image. And in this way, we can identify the poetic images that contribute to the humorous effect of a humorous poem. So the first strategy creates a delayed meta-affective switch through semantic structuring. In this strategy, the text gradually shifts from elements that evoke the base affect to elements that evoke the opposite valence meta affect. So in the case of the restaurant where you have to pay a huge bill, there's a shift from lexemes that evoke fancy food to lexemes that evoke having to pay a lot of money and leaving. So in this sense, the instinct towards meta-affective switch becomes stronger. So the corresponding poetic image would be that of a subtly growing, threat, and I think that's the case in Heine's poetry. For example, we find it in the poem, This is the Old Enchanted Wood, where there's a sphinx. The sphinx is originally made of stone, and throughout the ending of the poem, the sphinx comes to life, and it's clear that the sphinx will eat a lyrical subject, and near the end of the poem that happens. So there's a subtly growing threat. The negative meta effect becomes more prominent. The second way to create a delayed meta affective switch is through narrative structuring. In this strategy, the text adds a narrative device that makes the opposite valence meta effect more and more relevant as time passes. So in the case of the restaurant, for example, a character's children keep ordering more and more expensive food. So, as time passes, the danger of having to pay a huge bill becomes more and more relevant. The poetic image corresponding to that strategy in Heine's poetry that I want to use as an example is that of a dream that has to come to an end. So there are several poems in which someone is having a kind of idealizing dream, but that at some point the dream will have to end, and the poetic subject will be met with reality. So we find this in the poem Prologue, but yes, there's a lot of poems in which dream imagery plays a central role. A third way to create a delayed meta-affective switch is through thematic structuring. In this strategy, the text introduces motifs that evoke the theme of consequences or rules being temporarily suspended. This is quite rare, but it's in everyday situations, but it happens a lot in literary texts. An example would be carnivalesque celebrations. That's a motive, and this introduces a theme of consequences or rules being temporarily suspended. In carnivalesque celebrations, for example, the marginalized can have peace, but only in carnivalesque circumstances. And a corresponding image would be that of emotions being seasonal. So switches of emotions being related to a fixed movement in time. We find that in the poem There Lies the Heat of Summer. We find it in a couple of poems, also emotions being related to the changing of the weather would also be an example. And the final way of creating a delayed meta-affective switch would be through discursive structuring. With this strategy, the text presents a discourse dynamic in which the importance of the opposite valence meta-effect is defended by the voices that will be proven right, and or it is ignored by the voices that will be proven wrong. So at the end of the discursive dynamic, the meta effect will have been shown to be relevant. An example would be a foolish character that claims fancy dining isn't expensive. Because it's the foolish character claiming this, that it will be shown that fancy dining is in fact expensive. So a corresponding poetic image would be that of the romanticist as a dreamy fool. We find this in the poem Prologue. So there you have a romanticist knight character who is characterized as a kind of foolish character. He can temporarily enjoy an idealized situation, but because he's a foolish character, that this is temporary. At some point, he will be faced with reality. So there are also 4 ways of creating pseudo-resolution. Again, we'll have the semantic, the narrative, the thematic, and the discursive level. The strategy through semantic structuring entails that the text hints at a hyper-creative or non-standard way to interpret incongruous elements as evoking the base affect. So
5
in the
minutes are
restaurant
left.
example, okay, great.
5 minutes.
Yes, no, that will be fine. Thank you. In the restaurant example, a character finds an excuse to only order 1 course at a surprisingly expensive restaurant. So, and the poetic image would be that of idealizing dreams. So that the dreams aren't a real solution, but because of the hyper creativity inherent through these dreams, they allow for the negative meta, the opposite valence meta effect to be forgotten. In this case, a negative one. You can also create pseudo-resolution through narrative structuring. In this case, the text introduces something resembling a solution or a problem that would make the opposite valence meta effect irrelevant. For example, a character faced with a huge bill happens to win the lottery. It's an unrealistic solution. So in the poetry, we have a lot of, in Heine's poetry, we have a lot of old songs. So these are kind of, well, it's a motive. It hints at the poem describing kind of old-fashioned moralistic tale, but the old song ends sadly, so that the moral doesn't really lead to happiness. So you can have you can trigger pseudo-resolution through thematic structuring. In this case, the text introduces motifs that evoke the theme of pseudo-solutions or false problems. This is the case in satire about pseudoscience or moral hypocrisy. and a corresponding poetic image is that as of quirky love as an automatic solution. So there's a huge problem that is solved because quirky love is meant to solve everything. Um, this hints at the theme of quirky love being a universal solution, which is presented as a type of false solution. And finally, you have these pseudo-resolution. You have the triggering of pseudo-resolution through discursive structuring. In this case, the text suggests a discursive dynamic in which one of the voices presents pseudo-solutions or false problems. So you can have the clear example in literature is that of the trickster figure. So you have a figure and you know that this figure presents false solutions or false problems. And you simply have a lot of trickster figures in Heine's poetry, specifically Femme Fatale. There's a very famous poem about Lorelei. The actual title is I Do Not Know What It Might Bode. The Lorelei is a kind of siren that sings, and the singing leads to shipwrecks because sailors are distracted by it. Okay. So through this analysis, we can reach at least two conclusions about the function of humor in Heine's reusing of mythological and folkloristic images. Firstly, the analysis puts the emphasis on meta effect, and traditionally mythological images and folkloristic images are used to codify meta-affective thinking, so to codify how we have to ideally feel about feelings. Don't be blinded by love, for example. By reusing mythological symbols in a humorous way, Heine codifies the less ideal versions of meta-affective thinking. So the fact that we can temporarily ignore reasonable ways of thinking about love, for example. And secondly, we can relate Heine's practice to the context of late Romanticism, where there was a crisis in idealism. The historical circumstances made it clear that reality wasn't ultimately that ideal. There was a general sense of disillusion with idealism. And so in this context, mythical imagery hinting at an ideal reality became less convincing. Now, Heine's humor, as I've demonstrated, connects mythical images to irrational and fleeting emotions, the kind of emotions you find in real life. And as such, I would claim that it revitalizes a lot of the mythological imagery. Okay. Thank you for your attention. So what inspired me to work on humor in literature? I am a literary scholar, so I started from an interest in literature. And yes, so in literary studies, for a long time, there was kind of a prejudice against the study of humorous literature. It was seen as not serious enough to merit scholarship. And so there's still a lot of research to be done about humor in literature. That being said, in 19th century literature especially, um, you see that a lot of quite famous literary traditions revolve around humor. You have in English literature, you have Victorian nonsense, for example. In Dutch literature, which is my home language, you have humorist authors, and they're seen as the best authors in 19th century Dutch literature a lot of the time. Well, in early 19th century Dutch literature at least. But so this humorous aspect of their work is analyzed with quite primitive methods. So my idea is I can take linguistic humor models and apply them to literature, and that would give quite a boost to the analysis of 19th century literature.
Great. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you.